The sound of screeching tires echoed in the empty street, followed by the dull thud of metal against metal. Emily's heart raced as she stared at the front of the sleek black SUV, the crash still fresh in her mind. She hadn't meant to hit the car. It was an accident, one of those unlucky moments that could have happened to anyone. But the man who stepped out of the vehicle wasn't just any person. His presence was commanding, almost overwhelming, as if the air around him shifted with his every move. She tried to steady her breath as she watched him approach, his dark eyes never leaving her. Dominic, the ghost Romano, the most feared mafia boss in the city, stood before her, his sharp features cold and unyielding. She had heard of him, of course, who hadn't? But seeing him in person was a different story. He was even more imposing than the rumors suggested. His perfectly tailored suit and the way he carried himself spoke of power, authority, and a world that Emily could never belong to. "You're lucky," he said, his voice smooth, with a hint of something dangerous beneath the calm tone. "Most people wouldn't be so fortunate after a collision like this." Emily took a step back, not sure if she was more frightened of him or the situation she had found herself in. "I'm sorry," she muttered, her voice shaky. "It was an accident." "I know," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "But it's not about the accident. It's about what happens next." She frowned, confusion creeping in. "What do you mean?" He took another step forward, and her heart skipped a beat. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at her, like he could see right through her. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his words flat and final. "You owe me now." The world seemed to stop around her as she tried to make sense of what was happening. "Owe you?" she repeated, barely above a whisper. "For what?" "For what you've done," Dominic said, his voice still calm, but there was a steel edge to it now. "You've damaged my car. And now, you'll have to make it right." Emily's mind raced as she tried to figure out how she could escape this. She wasn't sure what kind of game he was playing, but she didn't want to be part of it. "I can pay for the repairs," she said quickly, not knowing what else to offer. Dominic didn't even flinch. "Money doesn't interest me," he said coldly. "You'll pay in a different way." A chill ran down her spine as his meaning sank in. This wasn't just about the crash. This was about something much bigger, something she wasn't prepared for. But before she could protest, he was already walking away, his voice lingering in the air like a threat. "You'll learn what it means to belong to me," he said, without turning back. And with that, the world she knew began to crumble. The days following the accident were a blur. Emily could hardly focus on anything except the overwhelming presence of Dominic, who seemed to be everywhere. She had barely recovered from the shock of that night when a call from an unfamiliar number interrupted her thoughts. "You're expected at the Romano estate," the voice on the other end said. "Be there in an hour." There was no discussion, no room for negotiation. She had no choice but to follow the orders. An hour later, Emily found herself at the gates of a massive mansion. The grandeur of the estate was breathtaking, but it only made her feel smaller. As she walked up the stone pathway, her mind raced with 1,000 questions. What did Dominic want from her? Why was she being dragged into this world? She had already realized that she was far from being in control, but now it felt like she was walking into a trap. When the large door opened, she was greeted by a silent man in a dark suit, who simply motioned for her to follow him. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked through the vast halls, each step echoing in the quiet. The mansion was cold, distant, and unfamiliar. Every corner seemed to hide another secret, another piece of Dominic's life that she wasn't supposed to see. Finally, they arrived in a large, opulent room. There, standing by the window with his back to her, was Dominic. The way he stood, his posture straight, his eyes focused on the city below, made him seem untouchable. "You came," he said without turning. "I knew you would." Emily stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say or do. She felt like she was being sized up, like an object being inspected for the first time. "I didn't have a choice," she replied, her voice firm, though the words came out shakier than she intended. Dominic turned slowly, his piercing gaze meeting hers. There was no warmth, no emotion in his eyes. "No, you didn't," he said calmly. "But you're here now, and that means things are about to change." Emily couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine. She didn't know if she should be afraid or angry, but something about his presence made it impossible to ignore him. He stepped toward her, closing the space between them with ease. You'll stay here, he continued. I've already made arrangements. I don't want to stay, Emily said, her words more forceful this time. But Dominic didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on hers. It doesn't matter what you want, he said, his voice low and steady. You're mine now, whether you like it or not. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Emily's heart raced, but she couldn't escape his gaze. He wasn't joking. This wasn't some power play. He truly believed that she had no say in the matter. And deep down, Emily knew he was right. She was caught, trapped in a world she didn't understand, with a man who seemed to control everything, including her future. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Finally, Dominic broke the silence. You'll learn, he said softly, almost as if to himself. You'll learn to accept this. With that, he turned away from her and walked toward the large windows once more, leaving Emily standing there, her mind racing, her future uncertain. She didn't know what he wanted from her, but she was starting to realize that she had no choice but to find out. The days passed in a blur, each one more suffocating than the last. Emily had spent the previous weeks trying to keep herself busy, trying to focus on the mundane tasks in the mansion, but the weight of her situation was always there, lurking. She was living in a gilded cage, and Dominic was the one who held the keys. She hadn't seen much of him since that night, but his presence was always felt. His men were everywhere, watching her every move. Every glance she caught from them reminded her that she was not free. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in on her, and the grand, luxurious rooms only served as a reminder of how trapped she really was. But it wasn't just the mansion that made her feel suffocated. It was Dominic. He had a way of being everywhere, even when he wasn't physically present. His voice echoed in her mind constantly, his words lingering in the air like a silent command. You belong to me, he had said, and now those words haunted her every step. The more she tried to resist, the more she realized how powerless she was. One morning, as Emily stood by the window, staring out at the sprawling grounds, she felt a sense of defeat she couldn't ignore. She had always prided herself on being independent, on carving her own path in the world. But now, everything had changed. The world she had known was slipping further and further away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She didn't belong in this world of power and control. She had no place in Dominic's empire. She wasn't like him, and she didn't want to be. But the more time passed, the more she felt herself being drawn to him, despite the resentment, despite the anger that burned in her chest. There was something about him, something dangerous and magnetic that she couldn't deny. She hated it, but she couldn't stop thinking about him. His cold, calculating demeanor. The way he seemed to have everything under control, even when it seemed like the world was falling apart. He wasn't like any man she had ever known, and that terrified her. Yet, despite her fear, there was a part of her that couldn't look away. She was caught between two opposing forces, her desire for freedom and the undeniable pull he had on her. She had tried to fight it, tried to push him away, but every time she did, he only seemed to grow stronger, more determined. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up. The thought of running crossed her mind often, but she knew deep down that it was futile. There was no escaping Dominic. She was trapped in his world, whether she liked it or not. And the worst part was, she wasn't sure anymore if she even wanted to escape. Every time she looked at him, she saw the power he wielded, and something deep inside her stirred. It was a feeling she couldn't name, a feeling that made her question everything she had believed in. As the days passed, Emily felt herself changing, and she wasn't sure if it was for the better or the worse. But one thing was certain, she could no longer deny the hold he had over her. The air in the mansion felt heavier as the days passed. Emily had grown accustomed to the silence that dominated the grand hallways, broken only by the soft footsteps of the staff and the occasional creak of the old floors. Dominic had been distant, his presence felt but rarely seen. Despite his absence, she could still feel his eyes on her, always watching, always waiting for her next move. It was unnerving. He had placed her in this gilded cage, and no matter how much she resisted, she couldn't deny the growing tension between them. She wasn't sure what it was, whether it was his power or the way he seemed to control everything around him. But something about him had begun to gnaw at her. There was a dark pull, a magnetic force she couldn't explain, even if she hated it. It was hard for Emily to ignore the way he had taken control of her life in such an effortless, almost cruel manner. Every part of her screamed to break free, to leave the mansion and return to her old life. But something deep inside her, a part she wasn't proud of, began to question whether she was truly ready to leave. One evening, after an afternoon spent wandering the grand gardens, Emily found herself standing in front of one of the large windows in the library. The sun had just set, and the sky was painted in shades of purple and orange, casting a soft light across the estate. She sighed, resting her forehead against the cool glass, trying to quiet the conflicting thoughts in her mind. She had been living this life for weeks now, and each day, the lines between what she wanted and what she was beginning to accept blurred further. She hated herself for it, for letting Dominic's presence, his control, seep into her life. Yet every time she tried to escape, to break free, something kept pulling her back in. "You look lost in thought," Dominic's voice interrupted her. Reverie, smooth and calm. She turned around to see him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. As always, he was impeccably dressed, his dark suit fitting him perfectly. His eyes, cold and calculating, watched her every move as if he could see right through her. "I'm just thinking," Emily replied, trying to sound composed, though her heart was racing. She didn't want to show him how unsettled she was by his presence. "About what?" he asked, stepping closer, his gaze never leaving hers. The distance between them was closing quickly, but she didn't move. She wasn't sure why, but something about the way he approached her made it impossible to walk away. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice soft but firm. Dominic didn't respond right away, instead continuing to look at her, almost as though he was measuring her, reading her like a book. Emily could feel the weight of his gaze, the power he exuded without even trying. It was suffocating. She was just about to turn away when he spoke again, his voice low and almost soothing. "You know, Emily, you're not as indifferent as you pretend to be," he said. "I see it in your eyes every time you look at me. You may not want to admit it, but you're not as strong as you think you are." His words hit her harder than she expected. It was as though he had peeled back the layers of her defenses, exposing her deepest fears. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just stood there, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. "I'm not like you," she finally said, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't belong here. This world isn't mine." Dominic stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. He didn't touch her, but the air seemed to grow heavier as he leaned in just enough for her to feel his breath. "You belong to me now," he said softly, but there was an edge to his voice that sent a shiver down her spine. "Whether you accept it or not." The finality in his words hit her like a punch to the gut. There was no denying it anymore. She was trapped in his world, whether she liked it or not. And as much as she wanted to fight back, to escape, she couldn't. Not anymore. The pull he had on her was too strong, and no matter how much she hated it, she was beginning to realize that she would never be free. Not as long as Dominic had control over her. The realization made her stomach churn, but at the same time, there was a small part of her that felt something else, a strange, unsettling sense of dependence that she couldn't shake. She wasn't sure what it meant, but the more she thought about it, the more she understood that her life would never be the same again. The days that followed were suffocating. Emily had learned to live with the silence that echoed in the mansion's vast halls, but it didn't make it any easier. Every corner, every space seemed to remind her that she was a prisoner in her own life. Dominic had given her no choice but to accept the fact that she was stuck in this gilded cage, and she couldn't help but feel the walls closing in around her. She spent her days wandering the mansion, aimlessly moving through rooms she had yet to fully explore. It was as though she were searching for something, anything, that might offer her a sense of control over her own life again. But the more she searched, the more she realized that there was nothing left to find. She had already given up her freedom the moment she stepped into this world. Dominic had made that perfectly clear. He was always watching, always there, even when he wasn't physically present. His influence lingered in every corner of the house, in every staff member's polite but distant gaze. It was as though they were all bound to him, and now, so was she. Emily hated how powerless she felt, how every attempt to fight back was met with more resistance. She had tried to push him away, to convince herself that she could escape, but each time she did, Dominic's presence only grew stronger. He had a way of making her feel small, insignificant, and yet she couldn't deny the strange pull he had over her. The same man who had taken everything from her was also the one who held her captive with a force she couldn't understand. He wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a master at manipulating emotions, and Emily was beginning to realize just how much power he truly held over her. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day spent wandering the mansion in search of meaning, Emily found herself in the library again, looking out at the darkened garden. The house felt even quieter than usual, as if it too was waiting for something to happen. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally. She had been trying to fight back for so long, but now it felt as though she was losing the battle. Dominic had a way of getting under her skin, and despite her anger and resistance, she couldn't stop thinking about him. She had never been this conflicted about anyone before, and the worst part was that she couldn't figure out why. Still trying to escape, a voice broke through her thoughts. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Dominic's voice was as cold and confident as always, and when she finally faced him, he was standing in the doorway, watching her with that same calculating gaze. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tired, as though she had already resigned herself to whatever came next. Dominic stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. "I want you to stop pretending," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I want you to stop pretending that you don't want this, that you don't need me." Emily shook her head, trying to keep her emotions in check. "You're wrong," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew that they weren't entirely true. She had been fighting him for so long, but in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had been fighting herself. Dominic took another step toward her, his expression unreadable. "You're not leaving, Emily," he said softly. "And deep down, you know that." The weight of his words settled heavily in the air between them. Emily didn't know what to say. He was right in a way. She wasn't going anywhere. She had long since realized that, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel more real than ever. "I don't want this," she whispered, but the words lacked conviction. Dominic smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. "It doesn't matter what you want," he replied. "You'll learn to accept it." The finality in his voice made her heart race. She wasn't sure if she hated him for it or if, in some twisted way, she had started to understand him. Either way, the truth was undeniable. She was trapped in his world, and there was no escape. Not anymore. Days bled into each other, each one indistinguishable from the last. Emily tried to ignore the tightness in her chest, the feeling that she was constantly being watched. Dominic's presence lingered even when he wasn't around. His men were everywhere, lurking in the background, always keeping an eye on her. It was suffocating. The mansion, grand and cold, felt more like a prison with every passing hour. Emily had long since stopped trying to find a way out. She had spent days wandering the estate, pretending she had some semblance of freedom, but it was just an illusion. Dominic had made it clear that she was his, and no matter how much she fought it, the walls were closing in around her. Despite the growing tension, she found herself questioning everything. The anger that had initially flared inside her began to fade, replaced by something far more unsettling, a feeling of resignation. She hated it, but she couldn't ignore it anymore. She was beginning to accept that she might never escape his grasp. One evening, as she sat on the balcony, watching the sunset over the mansion's sprawling gardens, Emily couldn't help but reflect on how much her life had changed in such a short time. She used to have control. She used to have freedom. But now, she was bound to this life, to this man. Dominic had a way of making her feel small, insignificant, but at the same time, he commanded her attention in a way no one else ever had. It was maddening. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the thoughts swirling in her mind, but the quiet hum of the mansion, the soft rustling of the trees in the wind, made it impossible to ignore. The door to the balcony opened with a soft creak, and she didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Dominic, you've been quiet." His voice came from behind her, calm, measured, yet with an undertone of something darker, something she couldn't quite place. "I'm thinking," Emily replied, though her voice was distant, detached. Dominic stepped closer, his shadow falling across her as he looked out at the view. "Thinking about what?" he asked though. His tone suggested he already knew the answer. Emily hesitated. What could she possibly say? What was left to say? He had already taken everything from her. About how much my life has changed, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Dominic didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, watching her with those piercing eyes of his. The air between them felt thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer now. You think it's all about control, don't you? He asked, as though reading her mind. Emily stiffened, her eyes narrowing. Isn't it? She shot back, her voice sharp, though it lacked the conviction it once had. No, Dominic replied, turning slightly to face her. It's not just about control. It's about understanding. Understanding what? She asked, confused. He took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. Understanding that you can't run from me, he said softly, his voice now almost gentle. You're already a part of this world, whether you like it or not. Emily swallowed hard, trying to push back the feeling of being cornered. She wasn't sure how much more of this she could take. I don't belong in your world, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You belong to me now, Dominic said, his words final. And you'll come to understand that. The finality in his voice made Emily's stomach tighten. She wasn't sure if she was more angry or scared, but in that moment, she realized something. She was trapped. She couldn't escape this, and more than that, she wasn't sure if she even wanted to anymore. The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. She had been fighting against it for so long, but the pull he had on her was undeniable. It wasn't just power. It was something deeper, something far more dangerous. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same again. The weight of Dominic's words lingered in the air long after he left her standing there, alone with her thoughts. Emily wasn't sure how to feel anymore. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in on her, the silence amplifying the ever-present tension. She had spent the last few weeks in a haze, caught between the pull of his power and her own sense of defiance. Each day felt like a battle, but the more she fought, the more she realized she was losing. Dominic's presence was all-consuming. It was impossible to ignore. He had a way of slipping into her thoughts when she least expected it. His words, his gaze, they haunted her. It was as if he had burrowed himself into her mind and wouldn't let go. Emily wanted to hate him. She wanted to resist, to run away and reclaim her life. But something inside her had begun to change. She wasn't sure when it happened, but the resistance she once felt was slowly fading, replaced by an uncomfortable sense of acceptance. She was starting to understand the truth. Dominic had control over her, whether she liked it or not. And as much as she despised it, she couldn't deny the strange pull he had on her. The more she tried to escape, the more it felt like the walls were closing in. One night, as she sat in the library, the flickering light of the fireplace casting long shadows across the room, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She had been trying to make sense of everything, trying to understand why Dominic had such a hold on her. But the more she thought about it, the more confused she became. He wasn't like anyone she had ever met. There was an intensity about him, something cold and calculating. Yet there was also something beneath the surface that she couldn't quite grasp. A vulnerability, maybe. Or maybe it was just the way he looked at her, like he was trying to read her every thought. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door to the library opened, and there he was. Dominic. As always, he was impeccably dressed, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his presence filling the room. I see you're deep in thought, he said, his voice smooth, but there was something in it that made her uneasy. He closed the door behind him and walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. Emily didn't move, didn't speak. She wasn't sure what to say anymore. What do you want, Dominic? She asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He stopped in front of her, his gaze intense. I want you to stop pretending, he said, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. I want you to stop pretending that you don't feel this, that you don't feel the pull between us. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. I don't feel anything, she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. There was something she couldn't deny, something she didn't want to feel. Dominic reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. You're lying, he said softly, his voice barely audible. I see it in your eyes. You feel it. And deep down, you know it. Emily closed her eyes, trying to block out the way his touch made her feel. It wasn't right. None of this was right. But it was happening. She couldn't escape it. I don't want to feel this, she whispered, her voice trembling. Dominic's expression softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something human, in his eyes. I know, he said quietly. But you will. In time you will. He stepped back, his gaze never leaving hers. You can fight it all you want, but you can't escape what's meant to be. The words lingered in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Emily didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond. All she knew was that she was trapped in a world she couldn't understand, with a man who had the power to control her in ways she never imagined. And despite everything, despite the hatred and the resistance, a part of her was starting to wonder if she could ever truly escape him. The silence that enveloped the mansion was oppressive, but Emily had grown used to it. The long, drawn-out days had become monotonous, each one blending into the next. She had started to resign herself to the fact that her life had changed forever, that there was no going back to the way things used to be. Dominic had made it clear that she was his, and she couldn't deny that the more she fought it, the more she found herself slipping into his world. She didn't know how to escape anymore, and to be honest, a part of her wasn't sure if she even wanted to. She couldn't explain why, but something about him held her captive in ways that went beyond physical confinement. His presence was constant, like a shadow that never left her. It was impossible to avoid him, and every time they crossed paths, that strange, undeniable pull between them became harder to ignore. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Emily found herself once again standing by the large windows, looking out over the mansion's grounds. The sky had long since darkened, and the distant city lights flickered like a million stars below. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. As she stood there lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. Slowly, she turned around, and there he was, Dominic, as composed and unflinching as ever. His dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, she could have sworn she saw a flicker of something in his gaze, something softer, but it was gone in an instant. You look like you're deep in thought, he said, his voice low, calm, and almost teasing. What are you thinking about? Emily tried to push down the swirl of emotions inside her. Nothing, she replied, her voice steady, but she could feel the lie on her lips. Don't lie to me, Dominic said, stepping closer, his presence filling the space between them. I know exactly what you're thinking. Emily's heart raced. I'm not thinking about anything, she said, but the words felt hollow. Dominic raised an eyebrow, as though he didn't quite believe her, but he didn't press her any further. Instead, he moved closer, standing just a few feet away from her. She could feel the weight of his gaze, and for a moment, she was frozen in place, unsure of how to act or what to say. You know, Emily, he said softly, his voice carrying an underlying weight. You're beginning to accept this. Emily shook her head, the denial rising within her. No, I'm not, she said quickly, her voice betraying her as the words left her mouth. You are, he replied with quiet confidence. You've been fighting me for so long, but deep down, you know that you belong here. With me. His words hit her like a wave, crashing over her and leaving her breathless. She didn't know how to respond. She wanted to argue, to tell him that she would never accept this, but the truth was that she wasn't sure anymore. The longer she stayed here, the more she realized that she had already begun to change, and she hated herself for it. You belong to me, Emily, Dominic continued, his voice even softer now, almost a whisper. And whether you admit it or not, you always will. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. His words, his gaze, they were too much. She couldn't escape them. She couldn't escape him. The truth was staring her in the face, and as much as she wanted to fight it, she knew she couldn't. She had become a part of his world, and there was no going back. I don't know who I am anymore, she whispered, the weight of her admission hanging in the air between them. Dominic didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, watching her with a quiet intensity. Finally, he stepped back, his presence still filling the room. You're still Emily, he said, his tone almost reassuring. And you always will be. But you'll also be mine. And that's something you'll come to understand in time. The finality of his words left Emily with no room for argument. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never be the same again. The mansion was quieter than usual that night. The weight of the silence pressed down on Emily as she walked through the long corridors, each step echoing in the empty space. She had spent countless nights like this, wandering the mansion, trying to make sense of her place in Dominic's world. But tonight felt different. The air seemed thicker, charged with an intensity that made her feel uneasy. She had accepted that her life had changed, that she was bound to Dominic in ways she couldn't undo. But there was a part of her that still held on to the idea of freedom, even if it was nothing more than a faint memory now. The large front doors of the mansion loomed ahead, their dark wood and intricate carvings almost mocking her attempts at escape. She knew it was futile to try to leave. She had tried before, of course, but Dominic always knew when she was planning something. There was no point in pretending she could outrun him anymore. As she reached the doors, a familiar voice broke through her thoughts. "You're not going anywhere." Emily turned slowly, her heart racing in her chest. There he stood, Dominic, as always, his presence filling the room. He had a way of making her feel small, insignificant, even when he wasn't trying. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and she felt the familiar sense of both dread and intrigue rise within her. "I wasn't going anywhere," she said, trying to sound confident, but her voice betrayed her. "Of course you weren't," Dominic replied, his voice low, almost amused. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You know better than anyone that you can't escape me." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine at his words, but she refused to let him see how much they affected her. "I don't want to escape," she said, her voice steady, though there was a trace of doubt lingering behind her words. "You're lying," Dominic said softly. "You may not realize it, but you're starting to want something you can't have, something you know you shouldn't want." His words cut through her like a knife, but she didn't let herself react. "I don't want anything from you," she said, though she knew it wasn't true. There was a part of her that couldn't deny the pull he had on her. She hated it, but she couldn't ignore it. Dominic stepped closer, his presence almost suffocating now. He reached out, his hand grazing her cheek in a touch that sent an unexpected wave of warmth through her. "You belong to me," he said softly, his voice almost tender, "and you'll learn to accept it." Emily's breath hitched in her throat, and for a brief moment, she felt like she couldn't breathe. His touch, his words, they both felt like chains, pulling her closer to a fate she didn't want but couldn't escape. She wanted to fight, to deny it, but every part of her seemed to soften under his gaze. She didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending that she didn't feel it. The truth was, she was already falling into a world she had never asked for, into a relationship that was anything but normal. But somewhere deep inside her, she knew that there was no turning back. "I don't know if I can accept this," Emily whispered, the words barely audible. Dominic's expression softened, and for a moment, she saw something in his eyes that resembled understanding. "You will," he said quietly. "In time you will. Just like you've already started to." Emily closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle deep inside her. She didn't know what was happening to her, or why she was so drawn to him. But one thing was clear, her life would never be the same. And no matter how much she wanted to resist, she couldn't deny the inevitable. She had already fallen into his world, and there was no way out. Not anymore.